Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on teaching about FDR's Four Freedoms, the Bill of Rights, and our liberties today with primary sources from the Library of Congress. I'm Sarah Badawi, Senior Program Director here at Constitutional Rights Foundation in Los Angeles, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Damon Huss, and I'm Senior Editor and Curriculum Specialist, also here at Constitutional Rights Foundation with Sarah in Los Angeles.
Hi, I'm Julie Shaw. I'm with the Barra Education Foundation, and I work on the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources, as well as the Our American Voice program.
So before we jump into the lesson that we're going to walk you through today, I want to give you a very quick overview of the project that we've been working on and from which we developed these lessons. So the Barra Education Foundation in Chicago, along with CRF and DePaul University, we've been working together for the last couple of years under a grant from the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources program to develop a series of lessons that would allow teachers to inject civic learning across the disciplines. So most people associate civic learning with social studies or civics classes. What we wanted to do with the lessons we would develop under this grant was to figure out a way to help teachers to inject civic learning into ELA, math, science, and other classes. For us under this project, civic learning is broadly defined, so we're really looking to take it beyond ideas of just teaching about voting or the Constitution, and to really get into offering lessons rooted in research-based practices that would emphasize helping students to build knowledge, skills, and dispositions that would help them to be effective, engaged citizens. So beyond just content knowledge, we wanted to develop lessons that would encourage critical thinking, that would give kids an opportunity to sort of figure out how to access and evaluate information, and hopefully to cultivate interest and concern about issues and feeling among students that they can make an impact on those issues that matter to them. Many of you have probably heard of the C3 framework. All of our lessons under this grant are aligned with the goals of this framework, which is focused on preparing students for college, career, and civic life. So we're really trying to take a broad view here and hit on a number of skills, knowledge, skills, and dispositions in students across grade levels and across the disciplines.
Thanks, Sarah. And this is what you're going to be looking at over the next half hour or so in this webinar. What we're going to do is we're going to walk you through a free, we emphasize, lesson. In fact, all the materials that we're going to show you today are free of charge. And it's going to focus on FDR's Four Freedoms of Speech and as those relate to the Bill of Rights. The lesson, as Sarah mentioned, it's across the program is across the disciplines. This lesson is in civics and can be used in social studies or even an ELA class. It is designed to meet the best practices that Sarah just described for civic education. We did have teachers review and also pilot or test these lessons out in their classrooms, and we incorporated their feedback into what we have produced and what we're showing you today. So we're really glad that these are teacher reviewed and tested. What we're going to show you today is the middle school version of the lesson related to the Four Freedoms. But there is an elementary version and a high school version, and we're going to talk to you later in this webinar about the differences between the different levels. We're going to actually show you what those different lessons offer. But let's go ahead and begin and look at this middle school lesson. The objectives of this lesson really kind of demonstrate what Sarah described as the knowledge, skills, and dispositions of effective citizenship or civic learning. And in this lesson, students will, as you see in the first bullet point, develop skills. So they're going to develop critical thinking and inquiry skills when they analyze primary sources. And then the next couple of bullet points, you see that this really represents the knowledge that the students are going to gain from this lesson when they discuss the several amendments in the Bill of Rights or identify rights or freedoms that might not be included in the Bill of Rights. And then also, of course, we look at the skills of collaboration, but that also kind of indicates dispositions, the collaborative and working together kind of disposition that we want students to take with them into their classes and with their civic learning that they come out of. Now, one thing I want to point out too is when you note that we're discussing several amendments in the Bill of Rights, December 15th is, of course, Bill of Rights Day, and because in 1791, that's when the Bill of Rights was ratified. So this is really a perfect lesson and a perfect time for you to be introduced to this lesson to use with your students. Just thought I'd give a little plug in there for Bill of Rights Day.
Duly noted. Thank you.
So the lesson begins with a brief discussion of rights and freedoms, what that means, what it means in the context of the Constitution. The lesson includes a PowerPoint that you can use with your students. If you're teaching middle school, this might review material that they may have gotten or hopefully got in their elementary classes on US history. It's really a refresher on the Bill of Rights, and it gives student instructions for lesson activities. So that would be very helpful, and it's also included in the lesson. And then, of course, the meat of the lesson is the primary source analysis. And that's what we're going to show you for most of this webinar. One thing I want to mention, too, is that the introductory discussion is the same in both the elementary and middle school lessons. And we'll show you again what that looks like in the high school lesson a little later. So speaking of introductory discussion, let's take a look at that. You see 2 questions here on the screen. So what we'd like you to do is to choose one of these questions and jot down your answer in the chat area for the next, 30 seconds or so. The first question here is, what if there was a new law that said if you break the law, no matter what law you broke, you must wear a hat for 1 year in public that says, I am a criminal. Or you could write your answer to the second question. What if there was a new law that required everyone to tune into a government news television station several hours a day, and all other television stations were blacked out during those hours? Just take a few moments to jot down your answer to one or the other question. Here we go. So Bob writes that it impacts his First Amendment rights. Indeed, especially that second question. All right, so that's one example of the answers you might get with your students. And these are actual discussion questions that are in the lesson to be used with students. And students in the discussion hopefully will pick up on, and you can kind of guide them to understand that laws like these would be very tough to pass because we have something called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and we have certain rights that are guaranteed in those documents. So you can explain to students that today they're going to explore the rights and freedoms that we want protected, especially in situations like we see described in these questions. So I'm going to just introduce you to the primary source analysis before I turn it over to Julie. And you see there's 3 elements of it here. First, students are going to analyze Norman Rockwell's depictions of FDR's 4 freedoms, and they're going to discuss that. Then they're going to review the Bill of Rights in light of those 4 freedoms. And finally, they're going to review additional later amendments that also are important when we discuss individual rights and freedoms. And once you've introduced this idea of constitutionally protected freedoms, students are really going to look at these primary sources with an eye towards encouraging a process of inquiry. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to talk to you more about that.
We were talking about inquiry, and so I'd just like us to continue our discussion in the chat a little bit and ask for your definitions of what inquiry is. What is, when you hear that word, or as you use it in your classroom, what is inquiry? How would you describe it to a pre-service teacher, for example? To explore options. Yep. An investigation. High-level questioning that encourages critical thinking. Absolutely. Giving students a chance to research a big idea or questions. Right. I think you guys are really hitting on some important points about uh, of giving students agency in the process, and encouraging critical thinking. And the library um, would say inquiry is a process of active learning that is driven by questioning and critical thinking, right? And it is very much involves student input and choice. So I want to ask one more question, inquiry question here, and why use inquiry? So what are the benefits to you as a teacher, to your students? Why do you use inquiry in your classroom? Again, if you can answer in the chat box, it doesn't have to be a full sentence, just a phrase is fine. Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. Allows students to participate, deeper thinking, always more than one answer, keeps students engaged to essential questions, gives them ownership and leadership. Absolutely. Really hitting on key points, nurturing student passions and talents, um, shows them how to search for themselves, keeps them interested. Exactly. You know, I think this is so important, right? We can always ask questions, but when you're the one answering the question, you're much more interested in finding out the answer of your own question rather than someone else's. And I'd just like to share with you briefly um, kind of some of the library's thinking about inquiry and why using it, why it's so useful, is that the understandings that students develop through inquiry are deeper and longer lasting than any prepackaged knowledge delivered by teachers to students, right? Not that that's not important, but um, as you've all mentioned here, that student agency is so critical. Right, and it encourages them to ask even more questions. Right on, Mark. Um, so not only is inquiry on its own so powerful, but when you combine primary sources and inquiry, the results can just be amazing. Primary sources just naturally engage students in inquiry and really transform the learning process by provoking students to question, make inferences, interpret different points of view, use those critical thinking skills to analyze and evaluate, draw conclusions, and pull together disparate pieces of evidence to think conceptually. Primary sources engage students emotionally and personally because they represent authentic voices and perspectives, right? So unlike a secondary source, which may pull in primary sources, but these are direct. They come right from the horse's mouth, and they don't just tell one story, but many stories. And all of these stories together help students to see the complexity of issues and recognize the importance of context for credible interpretation. So now we're going to take a look at the primary source analysis tool here. As you can see, this is the library's own creation, and it is available in a PDF version, which you see here, and they also have an online version that actually has drop-down menus with guided questions, and which differ slightly by different primary source type. But basically, what we want to point out to you is the three main sections. So observe, which is really I see, things that you can directly point to, whether it be in a text or an image or another kind of source. Reflect, which really answers the question, I think or I feel. And when we go through the primary source analysis, we really want to encourage the students to ground their thoughts in feelings using evidence from their observations, so that they're connecting what they see or read or hear to what maybe they know, or what those details make them think or feel. And in addition, of course, anytime you go through and look at a source, you're going to have some questions on your own that evolve from I see this and it makes me think that, but then I wonder about this. And so we have them in columns here, and we're going to kind of take you through in a linear basis. But when students do this, please know that it's completely natural to really jump through the columns, and that it doesn't have to be just do observe and then reflect and then question. It can be a circular and reflective process. And at the bottom, I just want to point out too, that there is this further an investigation box, and that sometimes you can use to either gather some questions that were developed in the questions column for further investigation, or maybe sometimes, you know, there's some questions that arise that may be not quite on the focus of the lesson, but still you don't want to lose, and so those can be included in that box. Okay, so these are 4 images here that are included in the lesson, and they all come from a Norman Rockwell series that was actually eventually adapted for use by the US government. But in order to do and focus on a kind of a quick modeling and practice of the primary source analysis, we're just going to choose one of these tonight. So here we have this one image here, and I'd like you to use the chat box and answer some of these questions. These right here you see on the left are some of the scaffolded questions prompts that we have included in the lesson if you want to use with your students. So feel free to respond to the first prompt or answer any of the other 3 questions. What do you see in the image? What do you notice first? Where's your eye go to? What else do you notice? What is interesting? And again, we're looking at specific details from this image that call out to you. It looks like there are 6 children, right? So there's definitely children. Upstairs, a slanted roof of upper floor dolly, right? I noticed the words. Children being tucked into bed. Okay, the parents taking care of the children might be a reflection that you see based on the mother hovering over the children's in the bed, a doll on the floor, parents, newspaper. Okay, the newspaper in hand makes you think of public information. That both parents are there tucking in the children. Great. Children look at peace, but it's okay. I'm going to come back to that about but the parents seem worried. I'm going to come back to that. The choice of words, only thing to fear is fear itself. Okay. So Mark, we're getting into a little bit of reflection. So can we move on to that? Next one. So the reflect column, again, we're talking about I think and I feel. So let's move on to that next one. So some of these, so Martine had said that children look at peace, but parents seem a bit worried. So that reflection, I'm wondering what details specifically, and this is open to anyone, not just Martine, but give you that impression that the children are at peace, but the parents seem worried, or make you think that the mother's comforting the children, or any of those kind of things. It represents family values of togetherness. Okay, and that because you see all 4 of them together in the image at once. Dad may have been reading and then joined in the tucking in process. Can anyone read the headline on the paper? Okay. The father has a serious look on his face. The mother looks concerned. Yeah, you might be able to zoom in on it in the digital one to read it further. But absolutely. So if you look at maybe the father's raised, the furrows in his forehead, the mother's outstretched neck might convey a sense of concern. Artists were commissioned by FDR to portray American values during the war. Ooh, Margie, that's great. That's a new observation about it looks like you can see lights on down the hallway, suggesting a warm hearth or room. I wondered why the father. Okay, so now we're getting into wonderings. This is great. Why the father felt it necessary to carry up the newspaper with him as they were tucking him in. Okay, can we move on to questioning? So any other wonderings that we have? The rug on the floor is opposed to, again, warmth. Also, maybe suggesting time. But what other questions did you have? Do the children normally sleep together? Are they sick? Any other questions that come up? What's making the parents so worried? No windows. Does that mean blackouts, or does it mean we just can't see them? Dad has suspenders and a white shirt. Is he a white collar worker? Interesting. This is really great. And you guys are all absolutely demonstrating how, as you dig in deeper and deeper, there are just more observations and reflections and ideas are generated. Fantastic. Great job. So I'm going to pass it back over to Damon now, who's going to give you a little bit more background information and tell you about the rest of the lesson.
Great, thank you so much, Julie. We looked at one of the images, Freedom from Fear, and as you saw earlier, it's part of the series of 4 images because the 4 freedoms speech that FDR gave included all 4 of these. And students would complete the process that Julie just walked you through for all 4 of these images. And once they've done that, then you can debrief the lesson up to this point with them and debrief, especially of course the primary source analysis, asking students questions like, what did you find? And so very specifically, you can ask them to share the most important observations, reflections, and questions that they have on their primary source analysis tool charts. You can also ask what comes to mind when they look at all 4 sources together. They've looked at each one individually. When they look at them together, what do they come up with? Perhaps they'll look at it as a set. These are 4 freedoms that all maybe are mutually dependent. Whatever the students come up with, but they're thinking about them as a group. And just for a little background, FDR gave the speech called the 4 Freedoms speech, which these all come from, on January 6th, 1941. That was almost a year before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the US entry into World War II. But what he was doing, he was really trying to warn Congress about what was happening in Europe with the Nazis, and that these fundamental 4 freedoms were being threatened in Europe. And of course, we value these freedoms here. And it set the stage for an appeal to the American people a year later to support the war effort after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But FDR was very concerned, obviously, and wanted to express this to the American people. Norman Rockwell, who then created these images, offered to create them for the US government. The government rejected his offer. Nonetheless, the Saturday Evening Post, which was one of the nation's most popular magazines at the time, commissioned and then published these images of Norman Rockwell's. They were really well received, and they later served as the centerpiece of the U.S. war bond drive, as Julie alluded to earlier, once the United States had actually entered the war. And so these images you see here are images from that war bond drive. The actual original paintings without the text related to buying war bonds are in a private collection, but through the Library of Congress website, we actually have access to these war bond drive era uses of the images. So once students have looked at those, there is, of course, this important additional primary source in the lesson. It's included in the handout packet that students receive. And so what students do is they look at the Bill of Rights here, and they try to find if any of the 4 freedoms they just discussed are actually included in the Bill of Rights. Are they in the source here? So students should, after analyzing this, they should find, of course, freedom of speech and worship, or freedom of religion, as we see here in the First Amendment, in the Bill of Rights. That's pretty clear, and it's right there in the First Amendment. But students might be able to also notice, well, freedom from want and freedom from fear are not included in any text here in the Bill of Rights. But you might ask the students if they saw any amendments that might relate to freedom from fear or freedom from want. And then when students look at the text here a little more, they might find that the 4th Amendment, protection against unlawful searches and seizures, the 5th Amendment, protection of due process of law, the 6th Amendment, protection of rights to trial, and the 8th Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. All of those might actually relate to freedom from want or freedom from fear, this fear of unfair treatment, which of course was rampant in Nazi-occupied areas in Europe. And the remaining lesson tasks are these. Number 1, students are going to be looking at some later amendments, really important amendments to the Constitution. And these are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So one important thing to remind students is that the Constitution can be changed, and that's through the amendment process. And it has been amended several times. So you can briefly go over the additional amendments, and again, particularly the ones that are listed here, the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. The 13th through 15th Amendments were ratified during Reconstruction after the Civil War. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, and that was after many years of organizing and protesting on behalf of women to receive the right to vote and have that right to vote equal to men. So the women's suffrage movement plays a role in that discussion. And then the next task, students work in groups of 3 to 4, and they are going to come up with their own amendment to the Constitution. So in here, students up to this point, looking at the primary sources and working in pairs, now the pairs can form groups of 4, some of them might be groups of 3, depending. You can refer students to the last page in their handout pack, which is this handout you see here, We Found Our Freedom, and explain that the students will need to refer to the sources to complete the following activity. And in their groups, they will think about the rights and freedoms that are important to them, but may not appear in the Bill of Rights. Everyone in their group shares their ideas, they listen to each other, especially listening respectfully. As a group, they narrow down their list to one right or freedom that is most important to their group. And finally, they write their new amendment in a few sentences about why they think it should be important, not just to them, but to all Americans. And they should be prepared to share their proposed amendment and why it's important with the rest of the class. And finally, for closure in the lesson, there's 3 components here. First, the groups share and explain their proposed amendment. And in this part, you can ask the groups, did people in your group have any different ideas? Was there any disagreement? And was it hard to narrow down their ideas to one amendment? And how did you reach consensus? This is really important when we reflect back on that early lesson objective that I showed you about collaboration skills. So this reflects on how the students are collaborating. How do they collaborate in their groups together? And then the second component, students turn in their primary source analysis tools and their We Found Our Freedom worksheet for assessment. And you as the teacher can then assess their work by looking for good observations or applicable observations, reflections, and questions on the analysis tool in those 3 columns. Also, you want to look for reasonable proposed amendment and what the reasons are for it, their justification. And finally, you also want to look for evidence of their group decision-making skills in reaching consensus, because that gets to the skills and dispositions that we also want to make sure students gain in addition to the knowledge of the 4 freedoms and the Bill of Rights. And finally, students may want to make posters to address the freedoms, or they may want to quote unquote update Rockwell's images to depict something that they think is important in the United States, a freedom that they think is important, and also what it looks like today. It might compare or contrast any of the 4 freedoms to today's United States. So those are possible extension activities for students as part of closure. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah, who will talk to you about the different grade levels and how it looks in those.
Thanks, Damon. So just quickly, I'm going to give you a snapshot of a little bit more detail of the elementary and high school lessons. And Carrie Doggett, our director of program here at CRF, has been keeping the high school teachers in the loop in the chat. So I'm going to show you some of what she was talking about in just a minute. But just quickly, for the elementary lesson, really, the lesson activities are basically the same as this middle school lesson that we've shown you. What's different in the elementary school lesson is that it includes what in this lesson was optional, but it's sort of a more integral part, the PowerPoint presentation that provides visual instructions for the students to help them move through the different parts of the lesson. And that presentation also includes a simple but pretty detailed review of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and sort of what they are, why we have them, where they came from, and what they include. So, so it's just a little bit more support sort of at every step of the way in the lesson to really help set those younger students up to be able to then look at these sources and come up with their own amendments, like Damon just described. For the high school, the starting point is a little bit different than in the elementary and middle, where we started with those questions about, what if anyone who committed a crime had to wear a hat that said I'm a criminal. The high school lesson begins from the starting point of thinking about powerful speeches and what made them that way. Basically introducing kids to the idea that, we're going to be looking in this lesson at a bunch of sources to explore a speech that for its time basically went viral. And there is a PowerPoint in the high school lesson to walk the kids through the steps of the lesson. And that's just to kind of keep things moving, because the lesson does have a number of different activities included in it. But after that introduction about, thinking about speeches and the idea of things going viral, the first thing the high school students would do is analyze a selection of primary sources and then arrange them in chronological order to gain or to build historical context. So just to give you a quick snapshot, the first document, or one of the documents that the high school students look at, is this issue from the Federal Register from as early as March 1941, where it shows a presidential proclamation blocking the export of certain products, quote unquote, in the interest of national defense. And so this provides students with a really interesting context that relatively early on, the Roosevelt administration was already gearing up for the very real possibility of the United States entering into World War II. Another source that students will look at, again, to think about the context, is a letter from Roman Totenberg in New York to a friend or family member in Sweden, and it's basically just kind of a personal reflection and concern about family in Europe in 1939. So again, helping kids to remember, okay, what's going on as we're considering these these events. And then another image that's included in these primary sources is this photo of a young boy with the evening paper announcing the bombing of Pearl Harbor. These visual sources that I've included here go along with video footage of the Four Freedoms speech that the students will watch, and an audio recording of part of FDR's Day of Infamy speech, as well as a couple of other sources and cartoons. So once the students have had a chance to analyze these primary sources, this variety of primary sources, then they're going to get into this idea that Carrie was addressing in the chat about this idea of something going viral and sort of how did the Four Freedoms go viral. The PowerPoint includes a number of images from different time periods showing how this idea of these Four Freedoms became sort of captured the popular imagination. So images of everything from matchbooks that were clandestinely smuggled into occupied France with the Four Freedoms translated in French on the inside of them at a time when matches were scarce. It ranges from something like this, from during the war, stamps that were issued, fabric that was created, a number of visual adaptations of the Four Freedoms, up to and including a 2012 episode of Modern Family in which Alex has the family stage the Freedom from Want tableau for Thanksgiving. So after the students have sort of looked at this span of this idea of the Four Freedoms, then again they engage in some debriefing and provides you with a chance to do some assessment, because they're asked to write their own Four Freedoms speech in which they outline 4 freedoms they believe Americans should keep front of mind today. So we hope that, having heard a little bit about these lessons, that you'll be keen to give one of them a try. We really want to hear what you thought about the webinar, first of all. So our first request is if you would please complete the flash survey. Carrie is going to put the link to it in the chat section in just a second. If you can take this flash survey, it's 4 or 5 questions, very quick, just to give us some feedback on this PD. When you fill out the survey, this will get you entered into a lottery. We're looking for 9 volunteers to pilot these lessons, 3 from each grade level, for a $100 stipend. And again, this will be by lottery. We'll just do a random sort from the people who volunteer. And you'll also be entered by completing the flash survey. You'll be entered for the chance to win a $50 gift card. So if you're interested in piloting these lessons, please let us know. You can find the lesson plans in one of 2 places. First, I'm going to take you to our own website, to CRF's website, where you'll find this page, and it opens right up to the civics tab, where you can see the lesson with a quick snapshot, and the PDF is right there with all the links to everything that you would need in the lesson plan. The other place where you can find these lessons is on the Citizen U website, which was created out of this grant, and you can find the lessons there as well. So we're happy to hang around for a couple of minutes if anybody has any last questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. But thank you so much for taking the time. We know this is a really busy time in the semester, so thanks for taking time out of your afternoon or evening to join us. I hope that you have make it through final exams and have a restful winter break, and we'll look forward to hearing from you with any feedback or questions soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.